Labour.
I voted.
I voted Green.
I just voted.
Hi, I'm a young person that just voted in the election.
My vote goes to Green.
Right, I've just got back from voting.
I voted Lib Dem.
Just voted.
I've just voted for Plaid Cymru.
I voted for Labour today.
I voted for Labour.
I voted Labour.
But what did we actually get? Before the election, I asked people to send me their messages to Keir Starmer saying what they wanted from him, whether they planned to vote for Labour or not, because a lot of people were not happy with Labour. But now, after 4 years of argument about whether Keir Starmer's Labour Party is actually going to deliver progressive change after 14 years of Tory disasters, the back and forth between he's just saying all this stuff to get the Tories out versus you're asking us to trust him by reassuring us that he's lying to us? That's over. The Tories are out. Labour has a massive majority, so whatever they've done in the last 7 months, whatever they've said, that is who they are. The get the Tories out excuse is gone. Since they got elected, they've told us what laws they plan to pass in their King's Speech. They've published a few of them. They've announced their budget. They've made hundreds of policy statements. So I'm going to show you what you should expect from this Labour government, both in terms of what you should logically expect based on how they've been behaving, but also what you as a voter have the right to expect from a Labour government. What could and should they be doing? What do progressive voters want from them? What are the experts in the sectors of the UK that need help asking for from Labour, and how does that compare to what they're actually doing? In short, is this Labour government actually the change we need? And that's why you haven't seen that much of me since the election, because I've been working on this. Yes, I've been putting out videos debunking the stuff that Nigel Farage and the Reform Party says, but that's because A, that work has to be done, and B, for me, that's easy and borderline therapeutic at this point. Because right now, everybody's going through an identity crisis. The Tories are trying to figure out whether they're the traditional David Cameron-style we just love austerity party or the populist, racist Boris Johnson let's burn the economy over Brexit party. But also for us as commentators, protesters, voters, we also need to figure out who we are as well. Because certainly for millennials, we've never been able to engage with a Labour government as adults. And I know that all of my personal bios across social media and across several dating apps all had me down as some version of the anti-Brexit guy that pushes back against the Tories. Well, the Tories are gone, so our strategy, our priorities, knowing where we need to apply pressure, that all depends on knowing what this Labour government is actually about. Knowing that will help us figure out how to make the most of the fact that the Tories are gone for the next 4 years. And spoiler alert, I've already been through all the documents as I'm talking to you now, and so I can tell you this. The framework is there for the change that we need. What I mean is, unlike the Tories, the laws that Labour is planning to pass cover the topics that we need change on, and Labour claims that they'll solve the things that we need solving. But while the framework is there, you're going to see that there are many areas that either don't have the substance we need or are still deeply Tory. And this matters because Labour has spent the last 4 years making no secret of the fact that they have been trying to appeal to conservative voters.
If that sounds conservative, then let me tell you, I don't care. Somebody has got to stand up for the things that make this country great. And it isn't going to be the Tories.
And it's statements like that, as well as Labour's stances on Gaza, Brexit and equality, that have meant that a lot of people who naturally lean towards the left have not been happy with Labour for a while. And while you will never convince me that Labour had to go as far to the right as they did in order to get the Tories out, we are where we are now, so we can park that debate. But that's the reality we're in now, and it has consequences that we now have to deal with. And you're going to have a lot of people telling you, be patient, give them time, they've only just taken office, but Labour has already told us how they plan to spend the next 4 years. So if they're pointed in the wrong direction now, we don't need to wait. And given that we might only have 4 years until the Tories or Nigel Farage replaces them, waiting is dangerous. Not to mention, we shouldn't have to, because Labour owes us. Labour got 34% of the vote in that election, yet they have a huge controlling majority in Parliament. So democratically, mathematically, Keir Starmer does not have the right to decide everything on his own. Especially when you think about the fact that a third of the people who voted for Labour did so tactically, meaning Labour was not their first choice. They only did it to get the Tories out. Let me say that again. Labour, our current government, got 34% of the vote, and a third of their voters didn't even want Labour. So, mathematically, how do you reckon Labour would have done if they only got 22% of the vote? Like I said, Labour owes us, so you have the right to make demands of them. That's why before the election, I asked my followers to make videos, sending messages to Keir Starmer, telling him who they're going to vote for and why. So we can compare what progressive voters want with what we're actually getting. And again, spoiler alert, there will be things that progressive voters didn't trust Labour to deliver, which they are in fact delivering, and others where Labour are being just as problematic as the Tories. So let's get into it. Here's how the laws that Labour plans to pass were introduced in the King's Speech.
My government's legislative programme will be mission-led and based upon the principles of security, fairness and opportunity for all.
That's cool. You're saying that equality is the guiding principle behind all the laws you plan to pass. We'll see. Because Labour is supposed to be the main party of the left, fighting against inequality and poverty. And 12 million people in the UK, a fifth of the population, are in poverty. 4.3 million of them are children, 100,000 more than the previous year.
Young people, old people, especially pensioners. Pensioners are finding it very, very hard to survive with all the bills that have been cut and all the money that was taken away. They're heavily relying on food banks now. I'd like the government to basically seriously look at all the money they've taken away from the people in general, because with all these cuts and more to follow, they're going to see a lot of people are going to become homeless. And basically, there's more than double the amount of people using food banks because of this reason. We're getting that social services people that basically come and have to obtain food from the food bank.
So social workers are
yes.
This is not a problem that's been, restricted to this particular government that's coming now. I mean, we've been running the food bank for like 5 years, and the previous government, it started then and it's got worse and worse. And it was when they were taken out of power, we were in huge numbers already. I mean, we've seen all kinds of people that you would not consider to be just poor or in the lower bracket. We've seen the people that are in the middle bracket who have got okay houses, who have suddenly realised that they haven't got any money to buy food.
And according to the Equality Trust, that poorest fifth of the UK, so 20%, has 0.5% of the UK's wealth and 9% of its income. Meanwhile, the richest 20% have 2/3 of the country's wealth and 36% of its income. So those who already have the most wealth are getting the most amount of money, and those who have the least amount of wealth are getting the least amount of money. So the phrase, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, is literally proven by the facts. Now, while yes, of course, on the one hand, there are things the government could do to improve the economy as a whole so that everybody benefits, and we'll get to that. We can improve the lives of millions of people by, simply put, sharing better, wealth redistribution.
And raise taxes on big companies.
I'm quite lucky in the position where, me and my family, we're in a position where we're not scrimping, we're not having to save. If I have to personally pay more tax to get the NHS back on its feet, then let's do it.
I would like a wealth tax.
I voted Green because their policy on wealth tax actually fund and commit to funding public services, raise taxes on the rich.
That's what people want, and we finally have a Labour government. The Tories, of course, hate wealth redistribution. But, and I can't stress this enough, most people are not Tories. Now, sadly, Labour says they won't be doing a direct wealth tax on the wealth of the super rich. Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies says there are pros and cons to a regular wealth tax because the rich hide their wealth in different ways. Shares, assets, property. But they do leave open the option of a one-off wealth tax to level the playing field a bit. But Labour haven't gone the direct route. Instead, they've gone with this.
We will abolish the non-dom tax regime. So we will increase the capital gains rates on carried interest to 32% from April 2025. We are increasing the stamp duty land tax surcharge for second homes by 2 percentage points to 5% to reform the energy profits levy on oil and gas companies. That we will increase the rate of the levy to 38%. We will increase the lower rate of capital gains tax from 10 to 18%, and the higher rate from 20 to 24%. We will close the loophole created by the previous government by bringing inherited pensions into inheritance tax from April 2027.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing people want to hear, because barely 4% of the country is rich enough to even meet the threshold where you start to pay any inheritance tax at all. So taxing inheritance in the UK is literally just taxing the rich. I am a bit nervous about this, though.
Our commitment to cap the rate of corporation tax at 25%, the lowest in the G7.
Bragging about taxing corporations less than ultra-capitalist America doesn't feel left-wing to me. And the stakes could not be higher. We all watched politicians like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage take advantage of the regional inequality in the UK, targeting people in the parts of the country that have been financially left behind for generations, telling them about a liberal metropolitan elite that look down on them despite getting all the benefits of the UK.
Waves of migration and globalised culture washed among us, eroding our sense of self. Whole communities changed colour and language. Alarm grew in the poorer parts of the country. but the self-confidently multi-ethnic, liberal, urban class, high on high house prices and high employment levels, was having such a good time they barely noticed.
They used the poverty-fueled desperation and anger in the parts of the country that have never been a priority for the government and told them that Brexit was the way to fix things. That's how the far right operates. But that anger in the north and non-metropolitan parts of the UK is justified anger. The UK has the worst regional inequality of any European country. The wealth gap between the north and the south is only getting bigger, and the government is making it worse. For example, it spends about £11,000 per person on somebody living in, say, the East Midlands, whereas it spends about £13,000 per person on somebody living in London. The idea that depending on where you're born, the government will care about you 20% less? Surely that's something that we, as people that are supposedly on the left, should be fundamentally against. And if we're not shouting about regional inequality as much as we shout about other kinds of equality, that breeds distrust, which the far right then take advantage of. Because they go to places that have been left behind by Westminster and they tell them the left doesn't give a crap about you, they only care about ethnic minorities.
These people up here are so frustrated, and you get other groups who come here on purpose. I don't know if you know what groups I'm talking about. The likes of the EDL or Tommy Robinson. They come to this city on purpose to cause that trouble, to tap into
the
that
anger
frustration, what existed for decades upon decades in this city.
We've seen how across Europe they've taken advantage of people's anger at the failure of the safe, centrist, middle-of-the-road politicians to properly and aggressively end poverty. And yet Keir Starmer has deliberately marketed his Labour Party as exactly that.
We are the party of the centre ground.
Meanwhile, most people want to fundamentally change the power dynamic between working class people and those who are currently in charge.
Late stage capitalism has failed. We need a fundamental redesign of how things are structured, who pays, and what that means for society in general. If that does not happen, the far right will rise in this country. I do not want my children to be growing up in a far right society.
So on regional inequality,
we will deliver a significant real terms funding increase for local governments, £1.3 billion to deliver essential services, with at least £600 million for social care and £230 million to tackle homelessness. We will provide over £650 million of local transport funding. We will deliver £1.3 billion of funding projects like the Brierley Hill Metro extension in the West Midlands, the renewal of Sheffield Supertram, and the West Yorkshire Mass Transit, including in Bradford and Leeds.
And that's a step in the right direction, but we'll have to wait and see if it's enough and spent in the way that's actually going to improve the lives of people in the parts of the country that really need it. Also,
we'll provide £1 billion from next year to extend the Household Support Fund and discretionary housing payments.
Again, good, and we'll have to wait to see what impact policies like that are making. But when you hear Labour say things like this,
every decision will be consistent with its fiscal rules.
What they're saying is they won't spend more money than they can afford, which is good in the sense that it avoids economic disasters like when Liz Truss crashed the economy with the mini budget. And you'll hear them make that excuse over and over again, especially around their budget responsibility bill.
And the damage that they did with their disastrous mini budget, and so why this piece of legislation is so important.
And they've already been using this to justify their refusal to allow parents to claim welfare to help with the cost of more than 2 children.
If we're not able to say where the money is going to come from, we can't promise to do it. And that's true when it comes to the 2-child limit.
Now yes, the country is split on this and does lean in the direction of keeping the 2-child limit. And if you'd asked me 7 years ago, I would have agreed on the basis of don't have kids you can't afford. But it took my best friend all of 3 seconds to convince me I was wrong. All he had to do was ask me, hey, why are we punishing children for the actions of parents? As one of my followers pointed out.
Just because you've got a 2-child cap doesn't mean the other kids don't need to eat.
Now yes, it'll cost money, but surely 1.6 million children growing up in poverty not having enough food will cost our economy more in the long term. Because hungry kids find it harder to focus in class, and if their parents can't afford stationery or computer access for those kids to learn, and that's going to affect their grades, creating another generation of low-earning adults who are more likely to need financial help from the state. Investing in children is investing in the future. Now of course it would cost around £3 billion in the short term, and the public public, according to the polls, isn't yet convinced. Not even Labour voters are fully convinced. So I'm not necessarily saying they have to scrap the cap. I'll leave that one with you. But scrapping the two-child limit on welfare support is clearly a legitimate left-wing viewpoint, especially as 38% of the people who voted Labour in the election want it scrapped. And again, take away 38% of Labour's voters and they would not be in government right now. So tell me how it makes sense to fire the MPs who voted to scrap the cap. 7 previously Labour MPs are no longer Labour MPs because they supported a policy that is objectively left-wing and is supported by a section of the voters who Labour relied on to get elected. That is mathematically, democratically and morally wrong, and Starmer knows this. In 2014, he said that Labour must not support policies that make child poverty worse. In 2017, he called the barriers to claiming tax credit on behalf of a third child shocking. And for the record, when you see me point to progressive things that Keir Starmer has said or done in the past and compare them to what he's doing now, it's not just to show that he's a liar or for a gotcha moment, it's to show that he knows what's right, or rather, what's left. He knows what progressive people want. So if he's not doing what progressives want, it means he's still playing to a more conservative audience. But why? Who is he trying to impress? The election is over. He has a huge majority. I mean, sure, if an MP does something that goes completely against the core values of Labour, then kick them out. But voting to try and take 300,000 children out of poverty, which is what Action for Children says scrapping the cap would do, is that really one of those things? Kicking out those Labour MPs rather than simply just telling them off suggests that Keir Starmer believes that taking such a hard line against child poverty isn't what his Labour Party is supposed to be all about, or he's still dancing to the Daily Mail's tune. Now, he has launched a task force on how to tackle child poverty, which is being chaired by Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall and Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson. So if you want to change this, that's who you go to. Now, Liz Kendall is also in charge of PIP, the personal independence payments that support people who are unable to work because of disabilities. The scheme has long faced criticism from disability groups, largely because of the 400,000 people who are currently waiting for their PIP reviews so they can get the support that they need, and the strict eligibility criteria used by the department that Liz Kendall now runs. And that's why
I did not feel like I could vote for Labour, because they did not mention any desire to overhaul the really dehumanising, cruel and abhorrent PIP system that we have currently in place.
Now, in terms of how Labour plans to reform this, they say they're going to come up with their own way of doing things, but during the budget, Rachel Reeves said,
We inherited the last government's plans to reform the work capability assessment. We will deliver those savings.
Which I interpreted as meaning they were going to do the same horrendous cuts to disability support that the Tories had planned. And Disability Rights UK, along with many other disability charities, said that would be absolutely awful for disabled people across the UK. They called out the Tory government's broad brush attempt to recklessly cut the number of people who are eligible for disability payments simply because the number of people relying on disability payments has spiked. But we've just seen with the pandemic that our NHS waiting lists have hit record levels, with millions of people waiting for treatment. So of course there are more people who are unable to work and therefore relying on disability payments to get by. Now, the budget says they'll be spending £26 million on new mental health crisis centres to take the pressure off the NHS. Again, a good step, but it's going to be in the details of how many mental health professionals they get to staff those centres. And what will the function of those facilities be? Will they be there for early mental health intervention, or just for when people reach crisis point? As the policy director of Mind pointed out, it's not clear how Labour's policies will help the 2 million people currently on mental health waiting lists. This was backed up by the mental health lead at the British Medical Association, who also pointed out the vicious cycle between extreme poverty and poor health, making it harder to work your way out of poverty. According to the chief exec of the youth mental health charity Mind, Dr. Sarah Hughes, taking away crucial financial support from people with mental health problems is not going to fix anything. It'll make things worse. And yet that seems to be exactly what they're doing, because Labour is cutting £5 billion of financial support for people with disabilities, which will affect 400,000 potential claimants, and according to the Office of Budget Responsibility, push 250,000 people into poverty. Like, even before Labour's disability cuts were announced, Svetlana Katova, the policy officer at Inclusion London, said Labour's policies better not go backwards because the UK's welfare policies have already been found to violate the rights of people with disabilities disabilities, according to the United Nations. Now, in the budget, there is £1 billion to help people with disabilities to do their jobs, but we don't know the details of that yet, so there's no evidence that that's actually going to help people with disabilities, the people that Labour is pushing into poverty to earn more money. But here's what they've hinted at so far. Liz Kendall, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, has criticised the excessive focus of job centres on policing benefits when they should be more of a job service tied to the NHS to help people get the support they need to get back into work. But taking away the financial support of people that rely on personal independence payments before you guarantee that you've actually got them work is the wrong way to go about things. It means you are prioritising your need to save money over the needs of the most vulnerable people in society. That's why you're hearing the phrase, Labour is balancing the books on the backs of the poor and disabled. Like you might notice throughout this documentary that my attitude towards Labour when I'm out and about filming around the country is slightly warmer towards them than my attitude to them when I'm filming at home. That's because I've had to refilm all the home stuff since Labour announced that it was cutting financial support for disabled people. So while the gist of this documentary is still, let's be honest about the good stuff Labour is doing so that they hear us when we talk about the bad stuff they've been doing, my attitude towards them as a whole has evolved. But now we get to Labour's plans for the economy in general.
Growth, and frankly by that I do mean wealth creation, is the #1 priority of this Labour government.
And here's Rachel Reeves, Labour's Chancellor, the person currently in charge of the economy, explaining why growing the economy is so important.
Our economy is so weak as is not generating the tax revenues that we need to fund our public services. It's why we have to grow our economy, because otherwise we'll just continue for the next 5 years having these conversations of how can you afford this, how can you afford that. The only way that we're going to be able to afford the public services that our country needs and deserves, whilst also being able to keep taxes low, is to have an economy that is generating the wealth and prosperity.
So when Labour says they can't afford something like welfare support for parents who are in poverty who have more than 2 kids, or any of the other things that a population in a cost of living crisis might need funding for, when Starmer says
to accept short-term pain for long-term good,
Labour is explicitly blaming that on the economy not growing fast enough. They're saying that if the economy was bigger, it would create more tax revenue because they'd be taxing a bigger pie, and so they'd be able to afford more of the things that we need. And this is where we get to the huge elephant in the room, because if
securing economic growth will be a fundamental mission,
and it's necessary to address the cost of living crisis, then logically, they should be undoing Brexit as fast as possible, whatever it takes. Starmer has even admitted that.
a boost to our trading relations. Growth is the #1 mission of my government, and what we understand clearly is that building relationships with our partners here in Germany and across Europe is vital to achieving it.
Because any policy that your own analysis says is costing the government £40 billion a year in tax revenue, costing the whole economy £100 billion a year, which the UK's Food and Drink Association says is making prices go up during a cost of living crisis, which the Bank of England says is costing the average household £1,000 a year, cannot be tolerated by a government that says its top priority is growing the economy to help people out of poverty. And that's why we really need to focus on this, because unless you can name another policy that's costing our economy that much money, then when it comes to improving people's quality of life, Brexit mathematically has to be the main focus. And Charlie also said,
every decision will be consistent with its fiscal rules,
which refers to the Budget Responsibility Act, which makes it so that the Office of Budget Responsibility has to give an assessment on any announcement that is fiscally significant. Basically, if it's going to take a big chunk out of the economy, then the OBR has to say if it's a smart idea to do or not. And just for reference, the Charter of Budget Responsibility says that government borrowing shouldn't go above 3% of the total size of the economy, while the Office of Budget Responsibility themselves say that Brexit is costing our economy 4%.
So far, the data that we've seen on the impact of Brexit, especially taking into account the fact that the new trading arrangements came in January, is broadly consistent with that assumption that we had, which is that it would reduce our long-run GDP by around 4%. In the long term, it is the case that Brexit has a bigger impact than the pandemic.
That's an equivalent of £40 billion a year in lost tax revenue. So simply put, not undoing Brexit goes against the government's first big law, because Brexit is the definition of budgetarily irresponsible. So whenever you hear Labour say they can't afford to do this or that, or when you hear Starmer say things like,
there is a budget coming and it's going to be painful. We have no other choice given the situation that we're in.
If he's not moving at absolute top speed to reverse the effects of Brexit, he's lying to you, because whatever pain we're going through, doesn't have to be this bad. He's making a choice to keep a policy on the books that is making people poorer and taking £40 billion a year off the table that he could be using to help people. I mean, listen to Starmer himself and tell me that this isn't an argument for undoing Brexit while he's still refusing to undo Brexit.
Working people know that hard choices are necessary. What they want to see on Wednesday is a country on a different path, making different choices. They don't want to pay the price anymore in times of crisis because our economic foundations are weak. It's time we ran towards the tough decisions because ignoring them set us on this path of decline. It's time we ignored the populist chorus of easy answers. It's time to embrace the harsh light of fiscal reality.
The harsh light of fiscal reality is that the government has £40 billion a year less to spend on fixing the economy because it's refusing to undo Brexit properly. Not to mention, Labour's big budget in October said they were raising taxes by £40 billion. Now yes, that is just a coincidence that it happens to be the same number that Brexit is costing us in tax revenue, but it does mean that if it wasn't for Brexit, Labour wouldn't have to be taxing us as much because the economy would be bigger and they wouldn't have to tax such a large slice of the same pie. So to make up for what Brexit is costing the government, they're having to take more from us in tax to pay for stuff. The alternative would be to spend less on us, also known as austerity.
Tax rises to prevent austerity and rebuild public services.
So Brexit is literally trapping us between tax rises and austerity. And given that Labour is cutting $5 billion in disability support, pushing 250,000 people into poverty while taking more in tax, it's not even either or. They're doing both, and it's having a very real impact on the lives of millions of people. And they know how badly they're messing up by not attacking Brexit properly. Because before the budget, they said their top priority was growing the economy. But then their budget was shown to actually reduce long-term growth. And when Chancellor Rachel Reeves was confronted about that, suddenly she's acting like growth isn't that big a deal.
The growth numbers yesterday are not the summit of my ambition. I want growth to be stronger and to be faster as a country.
The Office of Budget Responsibility, as you said, the acronym OBR, said that your budget would push up inflation and interest rates with a knock-on effect on growth.
Well, as I say, growth is largely unchanged in the Parliament.
We've also seen a slight increase in inflation, i.e. the literal cost of living, and Labour has admitted that both of those things would be made better by effectively reversing Brexit. So Brexit is a current barrier to the well-being of the people of the UK. And I mean that literally, because half of our trade is with the EU, a third of our food comes from the EU, and it all comes through ports like this. And Brexit means extra paperwork, extra checks, extra charges on all of it. If you look at the UK as a body, then this is probably the biggest blood vessel, and Brexit is a clot in that artery, slowing down the flow of all the stuff we need, making the rest of the body sicker financially, nutritionally, and medically. That clot was put there by the UK government, and they're refusing to remove it. And they're telling us that to our faces.
And we face structural challenges too, including those which have come from Brexit.
And she said that next to the Governor of the Bank of England, who backed her up.
Now, I've said many times as a public official, I take no position on Brexit per se, and that's very important. But I do have to point out consequences. The changing trading relationship with the EU has weighed on the level of potential supply. But it underlines why we must be alert to and welcome opportunities to rebuild relations.
So Labour can't hide behind the idea that Brexit was a decision of the past, because it's hurting us now, every single day. All the experts say so, and the majority of the public agrees with the experts. So
not making a decision is a big decision.
On top of that, Labour says it will
pursue sustainable growth by encouraging investment in industry.
Do you know what might encourage investment in UK industries? Knowing that anything made in the UK was automatically legal to sell in all of its 30 closest neighbour countries. And won't have to be held up in queues in places like this with expensive paperwork eating into your profit margins and forcing everybody to raise prices. But for that, we need to be in the EU single market. Not the EU, let's be really clear on that, the EU single market. That's the system whereby countries, regardless of whether they're in the EU, agree to follow EU rules and allow free movement of workers between their countries so that their goods and services can be automatically sold within the EU without being checked at the border or needing extra paperwork or having to redo their qualifications, which would add time and cost to their supply chains. So when it comes to Brexit, it's specifically being outside of that system that's damaging our economy. That's not about whether we're in the EU itself or not, because that's about whether or not you have a seat at the table in deciding the rules of that system. That's why Brexit was always doomed to be a total disaster, because if you don't follow the rules of the EU, you get poorer. And if you do follow the rules of the EU, then all you achieve by leaving the EU is that you no longer have a say in shaping those rules. You have a loss of control. When the whole point of Brexit was
to take back control. Take back control.
And when Rachel Reeves and the Bank of England talked about how
We will not be reversing Brexit or re-entering the single market or customs union.
they said it was about
Respecting that very important decision of the British people.
the implication is that we're staying outside of the EU single market because after the referendum in 2016, democracy demanded that. But let's get this 100% straight. There is absolutely zero democratic justification for us being outside of the EU single market. We weren't asked about it in 2016. We were asked about being in the EU, and countries like Norway and Switzerland are effectively in the single market without being in the EU. Not to mention, a board member of the official Vote Leave campaign, Daniel Hannan, said,
absolutely nobody is talking about threatening our place in the single market.
And Labour knows that too, because when I put it to Emily Thornberry, Labour's Brexit committee chair, she had no response at all. Doesn't it therefore make sense that in order to afford the stuff that we need, according to the principles he's just set out, we have to start doing everything we can to get rid of those trade barriers and essentially, in effect, rejoin the single market?
We're not rejoining the single market, and we're not joining the customs union. I'm sorry, but the public decided that we had to leave, and we have left, and we're not rejoining. So what we have to do is we have to have a close relationship with the European Union, and we have to do that within, the confines of not joining the European Union, not joining the single market, and not joining the customs union. But I cannot be pro being in the customs union and the single market.
Why?
We have to. Because of the political constraints in which we live, because we lost the referendum, we didn't get a second referendum, we lost the general election, we have now won a general election on the basis that we will not be going back into the single market and the customs union. We have to do, the permission that we are given by the public is clear. We have to make sure that we grow our economy. Clearly, growing our economy means being closer to Europe, and that's what we'll do. This is pragmatism.
But given that...
Come on, don't keep asking me. I mean, we're just going to go round and round and round.
Sorry,
I mean, I can't. These are the constraints in which we
But on that specific point, where does the mandate to leave the single market, to be outside of the single market come from? Given that in both 2017 and 2019, your party said retain all the benefits of the single market, and they got them, and the majority of votes went to those sorts of parties. Where is the specific democratic reason to be outside of the single market?
And can you imagine, right? If we were to say to the British public, let's join the single market.
Which majority want to do?
Then we would have to have a 2-year debate. We'd have to have another referendum.
Why?
I mean, how many people would be in favour of that?
Why?
Because we've had a referendum to leave. And not to leave the
single market. Not to leave the single market.
This is why this, honestly, I'm not going to agree with you.
Just so I'm getting this right, Labour's plan is to renegotiate Brexit in ways that are significant enough to significantly boost our economy, and according to them, that wouldn't need a new referendum, but negotiating full access to the EU's single market to restore our trade, that would. Says fucking who? Even if you want to argue that a referendum took us out of the EU, so it needs a referendum to go back into the EU, fine. But the single market, the economic part, the bit that's actually affecting the cost of living crisis, that was never on the ballot paper. And even if you want to pretend that a referendum in 2016, 9 years ago, is more important than poverty here and now in 2025, we had 2 elections after that referendum. And in both of them, the majority of people voted for parties that committed us to staying in the EU single market. So after not being asked about the single market in 2016, the country voted to stay in the single market twice afterwards. And the country currently backs rejoining the EU single market by a ratio of 5-2. So all of our elections and polls show that the country wants to be in the EU single market because we know that being out of it is making us poorer. Hell, even Brexit voters, by a ratio of 5-1, believe that Brexit is making us poorer, and only 45% of the Brexit voters who are still alive today want to stay out of the EU single market. And yet time and time again, we keep hearing from Labour,
we're not re-entering the single market.
This from a man who once said that not being in the EU single market and customs union was economic vandalism that our children would not forgive. You're goddamn right. And in 2017, Starmer said the benefits of the EU single market and customs union were vital to the UK, and so that those options should never be taken off the table. So why is he now saying
no case for rejoining the EU, no case for the customs union or the single market?
Now Labour is also saying
we do want a better trade agreement with the European Union. We want a veterinary deal with the European Union, and we're concerned about mutual qualifications.
The Product Safety and Metrology Bill basically says the government can choose to copy EU laws to protect trade. And that'll definitely help, because the former Brexit negotiator for the EU, Michel Barnier, said that how easy it is to get back into the EU single market will depend on how far we've moved away from the single market's rules. And the stuff David Lammy mentioned, those things are part of the single market. Having similar rules on food makes it easier to trade. Accepting each other's qualifications means that British IT workers can fix computers in Italy. But he knows it's not enough. He knows that unless you commit to the core principles of the EU single market and customs union, then anything you agree is still going to leave us significantly economically behind where we would be. And do you know how I know that he knows it's not good enough? Because in 2018, he said, Theresa May wants all the same economic benefits, frictionless trade while being outside the customs union and outside the single market, more chance of pigs flying or me playing upfront for Tottenham. So Labour's Foreign Secretary is on record as saying that unless they rejoin the EU single market and customs union, then they are not serious about fixing our relationship with the EU and addressing the cost of living crisis. And yet,
we're not re-entering the single market.
So it's like when Keir Starmer fired the Labour MPs who voted against limiting welfare support to the first 2 children. Who are you trying to impress? The election is over. You have a huge majority. Who's even left screaming in Parliament to be outside of the EU single market except for Nigel Farage and a handful of Tories? There is no upside to this. The EU offered us single market access back in 2017. That's only harder now because the UK government was then constantly hostile towards the EU for years afterwards. And you might hear people legitimately argue that it might be hard to get full sign-off from all the EU countries to allow us back into the EU single market. But those same people are also the ones making excuses for Labour not coming out in favour of joining the single market and changing the voting system.
Oh, sunshine. You don't get both.
The reason that other European countries might be hesitant to allow the UK back into the fold is because they don't trust that we fully de-Torified ourselves. They think that our politics is still infected with Brexit and a first-past-the-post voting system that consistently gives us governments that are more right-wing than the actual people. So it's precisely because of Labour's failure to do progressive stuff that other EU countries are hesitant to allow us back into the club. So the faster we change to a voting system that accurately reflects our progressive electorate, and the sooner we get rid of all the red lines about not joining the single market, not joining the customs union, the easier it will be to get the EU on board. So you can't defend Labour not changing the things that are making the EU less keen on us, while at the same time using the idea that the EU isn't that keen on us as a reason for Labour not to change those things. And I put that argument to Emily Thornberry.
Beginning with kind of reassuring the European Union that we're of good faith by ensuring that the Windsor framework is being complied with, and it'll take a while and there needs to be negotiations. And we will, as a result of that, grow our economy. I have no doubt.
In terms of reassuring the EU, wouldn't making clear to them that we aren't like the Tories, we aren't like that anymore, we aren't following the same red lines as Theresa May, etc. Surely,
they know that. They know that.
Surely that would involve, therefore, saying that we're not tied by those same rules as Theresa May. Given that we know the public didn't vote to leave the single market, the majority wants to be in the single market, and that is one of the major things that's affecting the cost of living crisis, making food more expensive, taking £1,000 from every household in the country, according to the Bank of England. Surely that is something we could say, hey, we actually are pro being connected. Surely that's something we could do.
I can say I'm pro being connected, but I cannot be pro being in the customs union and the single market.
Now, while Thornberry and I obviously disagree on the single market, it's important to remember that things are a lot more nuanced now than they were with the Tories, because she is trying to push Keir Starmer towards cutting all the red tape that Brexit has created to ease trade and make things less expensive. So on balance, she's pushing in the direction that we want. She's just not driving at the speed the country needs her to. But the point I was making is that if the Labour government loudly declared that we are down to follow the rules of the EU, accept the jurisdiction of the EU court, and accept free movement of workers, then that would change everything. And while actually rejoining the single market might take time, the improvements to the economy would begin immediately. We all remember in 2016 when the value of the pound plummeted simply with the announcement of the Brexit result. So there would be an immediate boost to the UK economy and a relative drop in prices if the opposite happened. Businesses would see the UK as a viable base of their European European operations. Nurses and doctors from across Europe would know that the UK was no longer the place where they'd have fewer rights than any other country in Europe, and so we'd likely see an immediate improvement in our National Health Service, especially as our crisis-riddled NHS has been screaming out for the better part of a decade that Brexit is bad for our national health.
And I know how you guys feel about that because you've told me.
He will also explore our EU membership.
You talked about young people getting freedom of movement in the EU. I'm Gen X and I want that freedom of movement back. In fact, I want to rejoin the EU.
Let's get the people back into this country that have left because of Brexit. Let's get them back working in all the places that we're missing.
Fix some of the shit that happened because of Brexit.
So I hope that all of you, especially young people, because you're the most affected by this, show up to all the anti-Brexit protests. The protests you've seen in the past, they were just about reminding people that they have the right to oppose Brexit. But we have a Labour government now, so they can actually undo it. So it's about making it clear to them that we simply can't afford for them to keep supporting Brexit just to please a bunch of voters from a decade ago, many of whom are dead. So you should be at the protest for two reasons. One, to reject the financial difficulty that Brexit is inflicting on all of us, and two, to reject the kind of politics that Brexit unleashed.
Because Brexit is what let the genie of far-right populism in the UK out of the bottle. Because yes, before Brexit we had Theresa, Windrush, go-home bans May, but Brexit is what made it okay for politicians to pursue all the anti-immigration racist policies, even when all their experts are publicly saying that this will significantly damage the quality of life of almost everyone in the country. That, let's call it what it is, extremism, is what allowed them to pursue Brexit, even when leaked government documents showed that no matter how they negotiated Brexit, it would definitely make people poor.
That's what allowed the Tories to end free movement of workers, knowing that it would make our NHS staffing crisis even worse, and cause labour shortages that have pushed up prices. That's what allowed the Tories to try and send refugees to Rwanda at a cost of £169,000 per refugee, which is more than it would cost to build a house for every one of them. But the public can see now that that kind of politics has only made us poorer. 2/3 of the country agrees that Brexit has made us poorer, and the politicians behind Brexit, they've admitted it as well, whether it's the Tories.
Brexit was more traumatic, I think, for this sector than many others.
So why have we got a significant reduction in trade intensity that stayed low, whereas others have come back?
Yeah, as I said, without a doubt, we're changing our trading relationship with the EU, and that means a different set of controls and things that people will have to do, and that will obviously have an impact, and that I'm sure is a big part of the reason why this is happening.
Vital drugs have not been able to be moved from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, 30 drugs, including cancer drugs. I think about 200 companies have stopped shipping stuff.
Or the Reform Party.
We're getting poor for a variety of reasons, of which Brexit is one.
But what I do think is we haven't actually benefited from Brexit economically.
Sometimes you have to take a little pain with some things for it to work.
And for the record, the parts of this documentary that are talking about the Reform Party were supposed to be filmed at a Reform Party rally, but I've had a little bit of trouble getting into those.
Even though I have a ticket.
That can be revoked at any time, sir. Your right on site has been revoked. I'm asking you to leave, sir. You're now a trespasser on site.
Record all you like, but we can take you off.
Please, sir.
You see that? He's really pushing me. I'm being physically pushed out of the venue.
Because, you know, party of free speech and all that, and so I figured I'd find the closest substitute available. So it doesn't make sense to be pandering to the far right anymore, because they've essentially admitted that they are a threat to working class people. And with that on record, they should lose every single debate on this topic. And Starmer was the head of the prosecution service, so like a top lawyer, and we're expected to believe that he couldn't win a debate about whether Brexit is good for working class people against the party that has admitted that Brexit is bad for working class people. So it raises incredibly worrying questions that Starmer is still pandering to dangerous right-wingers when he has such a huge majority. Because you either think progressive policies are good for people or you don't. If you do, then as a progressive prime minister, it's your job to implement progressive policies so that people can see with their own eyes, in their own bank balances, in their fridges, in their children's bellies, that progressive policies are good for them. That's how you beat the far right, and Keir Starmer knows this.
So the best argument against the far right is to deliver, to bring about the change that we promised we'd bring about. And that change was to improve living standards so people are better off, to make sure we got properly functioning public services, particularly the NHS.
Far right is on the rise. You said that only progressives can stop it.
So I'd suggest you start working with the progressives to try and actually make some positive change.
And the irony is, if Labour doesn't start undoing Brexit as fast as possible because they're too scared of what Farage might say about them, then people's lives won't improve fast enough by the next election, and that's precisely what Nigel Farage will use against Labour to become Prime Minister. On top of that, continuing to copy right-wing rhetoric only makes it harder for people to see the good that you're doing, because you're essentially helping them while telling them that things would be even better if we did more right-wing things. So I don't want to hear anybody saying, yeah, but Starmer did this, actions matter more than words, because words matter, as one of my followers explained.
But I feel like you are leaning into right-wing rhetoric in order to try to get the most power. It makes sense from a political strategy, but what it does is it emboldens really very dangerous ideas.
And again, we can debate another time whether or not he needed to pander to the far right in order to win the election, but we are where we are now, and there are consequences to the kind of rhetoric that Keir Starmer has been using. And the area where that rhetoric is the most incendiary: immigration.
Stop demonising Bangladeshis, Albanians and Indians. Safe routes for asylum seekers.
I'm not voting for continued pushing migrants out of the country.
Don't be fucking xenophobic. We need immigrants to survive as a country.
Now, those complaints were made about what Labour was saying about immigration before the election, which you can make excuses for if you want. But how are they framing immigration now that they're in power and those excuses are gone? Well, their border security, asylum and immigration bill does mention clearing the asylum backlogs, but the main focus is security, crime prevention, and sending refugees back to countries that we deem to be safe.
My government will seek to strengthen the border and make streets safer.
Seems like you're implying that the people who come through our borders make our streets less safe. And they make it so obvious, constantly linking immigration with crime, as if 72% of the crime committed in England and Wales isn't being committed by white Brits. And we see it even more clearly when it comes to the asylum system and the whole stop the boats thing.
A bill will be introduced to modernize the asylum and immigration system, establishing a new border security command and delivering enhanced counter-terror powers to tackle organised immigration crime.
Again, linking asylum seeking to crime, instead of talking about people who need our help, you know, as the phrase asylum seeking implies. Even when Keir Starmer is explicitly asked about creating safe and legal routes to claim asylum in the UK, he completely ignores the needs of the most vulnerable people on the planet, instead choosing to focus on it as a crime issue.
Will safe and legal routes be extended on your watch, and do you think this can play a role in stopping the boats?
Well, so far as stopping the boats is concerned, we have got to take down the gangs that are running the vile trade in the first place, which is why we're setting up the Border Security Command.
And when the Border Security and Asylum Minister, Angela Eagle, was forced to answer the question about the asylum issue specifically...
Do you need more safe routes? I mean, there are charities, respected Labour figures like Lord Dubs have pointed out that the reason that so many people fleeing war and torture from countries like Syria or Sudan is because there aren't any viable alternatives.
But not everybody who's fleeing torture or collapse in their own country would ever have a right to come to the UK.
Now that's dishonest in a number of ways. For starters, nobody is talking about every single refugee on the planet coming to the UK. Most of them stay in the countries that are nearby to their home countries. Because Germany and France have far higher refugee populations than we do, and yet Labour is repeating the same Tory scaremongering that being compassionate for refugees means taking in all refugees. And they're being legally wrong in doing so, because it's a matter of international law. Under the Refugee Convention, anybody fleeing war or persecution or torture has the right to claim asylum, or at least try to, in any country.
We can only take so many people.
Sure, but that's a conversation we can only really start having once we've cleared the asylum backlog on all the people we're holding in hotels and allowed those people to start working, contributing to our economy and helping with our chronic staffing shortages. 30,000 people crossed the channel last year. Meanwhile, the level of normal immigration was 1.2 million, and just under half of that number left the UK. So 30,000 asylum seekers is not overwhelming our immigration system.
Do we need more safe routes?
Well, there is a safe route system.
See, there she's repeating the same Tory lie that there are safe legal routes to enter the UK to claim asylum, even though Suella Braverman herself admitted that for most people coming from most countries, those routes simply don't exist.
I'm not Syrian, I'm not Afghan, I'm not Ukrainian, not any of those. What scheme's open to me?
Well, if you are able to get to the UK, you are able to put in an application for asylum.
I would only enter the UK illegally then, wouldn't I?
Well, that would, if you put in your application for asylum upon arrival, that would be the process that you enter.
And so if you want to claim asylum in the UK, you have to go through this. Like, if there were safe and legal routes to claim asylum in the UK, wouldn't you prefer to use those rather than risking your life in that? Because if you're forced to leave your country because of war, famine, or persecution, your life has been reduced to zero. You're having to rebuild from scratch. So of course, if English is your second language, because we did some horrendous stuff and spread our language all over the globe, then for some of you, the place you're going to want to rebuild your life is going to be the UK. And with the UK not providing safe legal routes to claim asylum in the UK, with your life reduced to zero, you're going to take some risks to rebuild it. But the narrative we hear from the government about smash the gangs implies that they're doing this because they just like crime. But it's the UK's government's failure to uphold international law and provide safe legal routes to claim asylum in the UK that is keeping the smuggling industry going. So really, the main people making a career off this criminal industry is UK politicians. Every politician who you see basing their entire platform on smashing the gangs, stopping the boats, whether it's Labour or Reform, they're the ones making their career by profiting from the criminality that they say they're trying to stop.
We've got to deal with that as a security and a law and order issue.
It's the constant implication from politicians and journalists that immigration and refugees automatically means crime. It's never about compassion. It's always about seeing foreigners as a threat.
The biggest threat to our borders at the moment is the very many people arriving by small boat over the Channel.
That's why when Keir Starmer was asked to challenge Nigel Farage for stoking the hatred and conspiracy theories that fueled the recent race riots, aka white supremacist terrorism, he refused, because he knows that he's been singing the same tune, just in a different key. That's why Sneakrit said,
I've been a lifelong Labour voter. This year, I voted Green, because I can't do it. And just the rhetoric that we've seen in the last couple of months is just too much. I can't do it. Feeling like I'm putting other people at risk as well. Stop playing into the culture wars. Stop blaming minorities for everything.
Bear in mind, Sneakrit couldn't bring herself to vote for Labour because their negative language around immigration was putting people at risk in late June. And by late July, mosques, people seeking asylum, black and brown people were being targeted by domestic terrorists off the back of the scapegoating language around immigration. So the people who shared her concerns about why language matters were proven right pretty damn quickly. The phrase "sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me" is kind of outdated because those words led to things a lot more dangerous than sticks and stones being thrown at refugees. Meanwhile, Labour is putting out videos celebrating ripping people out of their homes in the middle of the night to deport them. Now yes, if somebody overstays their visa, if they come here irregularly and don't apply for asylum within a reasonable period of time, then you're going to have to deport some people. But to celebrate that publicly for political gain is sick. If somebody steals a loaf of bread because they're hungry, you don't make them public enemy number one. Their crime is trying to live normal lives in the UK like the rest of us, but they don't have the paperwork because they weren't lucky enough to be born here. There are far worse crimes that they could be directing our anger towards. But doing this suggests they're still pushing the narrative that foreigners suffering is the same as Brits prospering, which shows that Labour is still choosing to be part of the problem, which doesn't even make any sense.
Especially as, just like with Brexit, we've already got all the evidence we need from seeing the anti-immigration agenda play out. We've already seen that everything our government has ever tried to do in the name of cutting immigration, from Brexit to Rwanda, has only ever made us poorer. We've seen what happened when we finally took back control of our borders with Brexit, which right-wing politicians said we had to do because immigration was driving down wages, because they argued that foreigners were accepting lower pay.
But when Brits demanded to be paid more, it was right-wingers who told them to get lost.
The Tories passed laws to limit the rights of workers to demand better pay by going on strike, and the Reform Party and Nigel Farage accused striking nurses and teachers of being part of a left-wing conspiracy, which on top of the fact that they've admitted that Brexit is making people poorer, proves that these people never actually gave a shit about the wages or living conditions of working-class people. They just wanted to use our suffering as a weapon for xenophobia. Which brings us to workers' rights.
My government is committed to making work pay and will legislate to introduce a new deal for working people, to ban exploitative practices and enhance employment rights.
That does sound good, and in their employment rights bill, even though Labour isn't fully banning 0 hours contracts, they are requiring employers to make an offer to their employees every month or so, stating a guaranteed minimum number of hours that they'll be working. And given that the TUC, one of the biggest unions, has been criticising 0 hours contracts on the basis that they leave workers without guaranteed hours and therefore without guaranteed income, this is definitely a step in the right direction. The bill was also supposed to ban fire and rehire, which is the process that allows employers to fire all their staff so that they can rehire them on worse terms, like worse pay. We saw that with Centrica, the company that owns British Gas, and I'll link to my interview with the GMB union about how horrendous that was. Now, it kind of bans fire and rehire by allowing workers to sue their former bosses if the boss tries to change the terms of the employment and then you refuse and then they fire you. Or if it's clear that they fired you, simply so they could hire somebody else for the same work but on lower pay. Now, there is a potential loophole if the boss can prove that they had to do it in order to avoid the business going under, but in general this should prevent bosses firing people en masse just to maximize profits by exploiting people on low wages. The bill also makes sure that everybody has the right to parental leave, sick pay, and protection from unfair dismissal from day one. It also allows dads to take paternity leave immediately after a period of shared parental leave. The bill also undoes the Tories' laws that make it harder to go on strike to demand better working conditions. They'll also be making it easier for employees to join and benefit from unions by requiring employers to notify their employees of their right to join unions. It also grants unions access to workplaces so that they can represent and recruit new workers. And given that so much of the immigration debate is based around the idea that having more people gives employers the upper hand because there are more people competing for the same jobs, and so the big bosses can simply choose whoever's willing to work for the least amount of money, policies aimed at strengthening workers in their negotiations with the bosses by allowing them to join forces with other workers as unions, they not only allow working class people to demand to be paid fairly, but they disarm the arguments against immigration used by people like Nigel Farage. So that's objectively good stuff. It's the opposite of what the Tories have always done. If you look at their voting records, they've always voted to restrict workers' rights. And when it comes to the minimum wage, that's going up.
We will accept the Low Pay Commission recommendation to increase the national living wage by 6.7% to £12.21 an hour.
And more importantly,
we will move towards a single adult rate by initially increasing the national minimum wage for 18 to 20-year-olds, taking it to £10 an hour.
Closing the gap between the minimum wage, what an 18-year-old has to be paid, and the living wage, what anybody over the age of 21 has to be paid, is an essential step in balancing out our economy, which has always been geared towards paying older people more as if they somehow work harder. Things seem to be heading in the right direction. Now that's what you'd expect at a minimum, the Labour Party backing labourers, but that's after 14 years of the Conservatives being actively hostile towards workers. So it's important to recognise the progress. But here's one area where Labour has definitely fallen down in terms of being a party of the working class.
We will increase the rate of employers' national insurance by 1.2 percentage points to 15% from April 2025.
And yes, I am including this under workers' rights because the right to be paid fairly for the work that you do is a workers' right. And the UK has the 9th highest level of income inequality among the top 38 richest countries. So the aim of any party of the working class that is looking to achieve equality should be to close the gap between what rich people earn and what poor people do. So you'd expect them to be raising taxes on the highest earners, especially as the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the organisation that the government regularly quotes to back up their tax policies, says that taxing the top earners more reduces inequality. Unfortunately, Labour set itself a rule during the election.
Labour will not be increasing taxes on working people. I am very clear about that.
And according to the IFS, that makes it harder to do what needs to be done, because it takes the option of taxing the top earners off the table.
There was that no tax rises on working people, no increases in income tax, national insurance, VAT, and corporation tax. Put those together, if you take that seriously, that's 3/4 of all taxes they can't raise.
And those are further constraints in the sort of parameters of how they can respond.
Choosing instead to increase the tax that employers pay per employee makes it more expensive to employ people. And the Office of Budget Responsibility, the government's economists, say that this is likely to lead to lower wages in the long run. And Rachel Reeves has admitted this.
And yes, businesses will now have to make a choice whether they will absorb that through efficiency and productivity gains, whether it will be through lower profits or perhaps through lower wage growth.
What's even even worse is, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies,
it is absolutely going to hit working people on lower middle incomes as well as people at the top. And actually, the way they've done the employer NICs increase, it's more on lower middle income people than you would have got from other direct tax increases like income tax, or just by increasing the rate.
So that burden, that loss in wages, will be felt hardest by the poorest in society. So why did Labour tie their hands with this no taxes on working people stuff? I think it stems from this interview.
You describe yourself as working class. Sakir, define working class.
Look, working class is families that work for their living, earn their money through going out to work every day, not through other
not
means.
Middle classes do that?
Well, working class families have the ordinary hope to get on in life. I mean, this has been a story.
Middle classes have that
Yeah,
as
of course they do. Of course they do.
I mean, he could have just said that working class people are those at the poorer end of the economy, although that group gets larger every day as living standards fall during the cost of living crisis. And so when I say we're a party of the working class, I mean we're a party that stands against poverty and the exploitation of people for whom staying warm and fed is a weekly challenge. But helping those people will involve an element of wealth redistribution, i.e. taxing the rich to feed the poor. And Tories are fundamentally against that, so he couldn't risk that during the election, and so here we are. Another opportunity to help the people at the sharp end of the cost of living crisis lost because Labour is too scared to be a party of equality. Now, when it comes to racism in employment, they say
legislation on race equality will be published in draft to enshrine the full right to equal pay in law.
But their draft equality, race and disability bill really only focuses on equal pay in the strict sense, not the pay gap. You know, like how the gender pay gap is about women not being hired for the higher paid roles, not necessarily about them being paid less for the exact same work. Now, as many of you know, Oxford University research used thousands of fake CVs with identical qualifications, only changing the names, and found that people with ethnic minority names had to send between 70 and 90% more applications to get a callback from employers, compared to stereotypically white names. So what Labour needs to do is to make it compulsory or significantly financially beneficial through taxes for all companies to use anonymous job application processes, where the only thing the employer sees is the applicant's national insurance number, no name, no email address. Because that will address discrimination in terms of race, gender and class, because you won't see which town or school the person's from. Because if Labour is serious about working towards equality, then this has to be done. Because if it's 80% harder for somebody with a black sounding name to get a job, then it's 80% harder to make money, 80% harder to escape poverty. It means that quality of life in the UK passes through a filter of racism, as well as classism and sexism. But on race, there's an extra level to it. Because we need to end the poverty prison pipeline. It is well established, including in the government's Beating Crime Plan, which the Tories published in 2021, that poverty, specifically the desperation that comes from not being able to escape poverty, is one of the biggest factors that push people towards crime. And black families are statistically more likely to be in poverty than any other. And because of the hiring discrimination that I just mentioned, that makes it 80% harder for black people to escape that poverty, which traps many black people living in high poverty and high crime areas that are over-policed by police forces that have been found to be institutionally racist, sexist, and homophobic, and 4 times more likely to use violence against black suspects than white suspects. Now, of course, part of fixing that will involve addressing the institutional problems within the police which led to that, along with the several instances of sexual misconduct that came to light after Sarah Everard. And Labour says their crime and policing bill will introduce higher mandatory vetting standards across all police forces, and that's cool, but that's only part of solving the problem. Giving black people a fair shot at a decent life, free from poverty, will take black people out of the literal line of fire of the police and end the poverty prison pipeline. So anonymizing job applications to combat hiring discrimination is a pretty big ball for Labour to be dropping. And yes, of course it won't solve everything. There'll still be racism at the interview stage, but it'll be a lot more obvious to the employer themselves when black qualified applicants keep walking out of their interview rooms without a job. So it'll no longer be subconscious bias, and decent employers will do something about that. And at the very least, it'll get more feet through the doors of the top jobs from diverse backgrounds. That means Asian feet, black feet, northern feet, Welsh feet, female feet, working class feet.
And there's some evidence that this affects female applicants as well, though the main issue there is about promotion rates rather than hiring, especially when you bring class into it. With working class women well behind working class men and middle class women in terms of how often they're promoted at work. Now, some of that gender discrimination will be because women are more likely to take parental leave. And let's be honest about that. If women are more likely to go on parental leave, then employers will have that at the back of their minds in terms of who they promote. So that is a permanent gender pay gap, which if Labour is serious about equality, they have to fix. I've had a boss complain to my face about there being too many strong-willed women in the office going off and having bleeding babies. So this problem isn't just statistics, it's real. Let's be clear, childbirth and child raising is kind of essential to the economy. No people, no money. So let's stop pretending that biological labour isn't economic labour. So justice says that women should not be paid less when they work just as hard as men. Because men, when's the last time one of your employers asked you to pull a person out of your ass or wake up 5 times in the middle of the night to have your nipples chewed up and sucked dry? So if we want to achieve equality, we have to remove the very concept of maternity leave and childcare from the minds of employers when they're hiring. And I can see 2 ways of doing that. Funding free childcare properly and making it so that men take just as much parental leave as women do. And there are a bunch of ways you could socially engineer that, such as tax incentives that encourage paternity leave. And yeah, all the ways of solving this are going to have their downsides, but the alternative is simply accepting that women are always going to be paid less. And I don't accept that, do you? And if it doesn't get fixed under Labour, do you really think the Tories are going to do anything like that? So we can't afford to wait. Not to mention, given the role that financial inequality and financial struggle plays in women and girls facing abuse of all kinds, the stakes could not be higher.
To all those people that just don't get it, they will say, what are women complaining about? They have rights. Everything's come leaps and bounds, but we know that violence against women and girls in this country has risen 37% since 2018. This is a national emergency, but there are still so many people that are too comfortable to just acknowledge it. In England and Wales, the law still criminalises abortion if it doesn't meet strict criteria. Women experience not just sexism, ageism, ableism, homophobia and transphobia and racism. Now, a feminism that doesn't challenge racism and imperialism is no feminism at all.
And as a couple of personal suggestions for any lawmakers who are serious about the safety of women and girls, change the laws for possession of weapons for women and women only. I want every man who considers physically bothering a woman to know that that physical advantage that they think they have might not count for shit. And my other suggestion is because I've had too many women tell me about the horrendous stuff that a man has done to them, but they haven't reported it because given the horrendously low conviction rate, they don't know if it'll even be worth it to go through the additional trauma of the reporting process. And selfishly, I'm tired of feeling helpless to help them. I think the burden of reporting sexual offences should be shared with men. So I would like Labour to change the law to allow the victims of sexual offences to designate a friend to act on their behalf when it comes to the reporting of the crime. They film their statement about the crime, explaining what happened, and they give it to their friend along with their driving licence, and that friend goes to the police station and reports the crime for them. Any further questions the police have are sent to the friend, who can then ask the victim in their own time in a way that is less likely to re-traumatize them. Now, I know lawyers can obviously act as representatives, but anything that can reduce the victim's direct input, I'd prefer. So make sure you're keeping up with groups like Rape Crisis England and Wales, Enough to End Rape, and End Violence Against Women if you want to campaign on this issue. But yeah, going back to the world of work more generally, there's definitely good stuff in what Labour is proposing, but it needs to go further. So keep an eye on what workers' unions say as the bill goes through Parliament. Speaking of unions, how has Labour handled the strikes?
Decent funding for the NHS. We shouldn't have clapped, we should have paid them. Get down to the picket lines, make it happen.
I want NHS staff to actually be paid the money that they're deserving.
The government has agreed an offer to the junior doctors, which the BMA are recommending.
The British Medical Association supported the offer that was made to junior doctors. And that's alongside 5.5% pay rises for nurses, paramedics and teachers, although I personally know a former nurse who currently works in retail, wants to return to nursing, but the fact that nurses still have to pay for parking in hospitals would completely wipe out the pay rise, so it's not worth it. Which is just one of the reasons why nurses in England have rejected that offer, because they've seen their pay go down in real terms over the last decade and a half. And now we're in a cost of living crisis. And this is critical for public services like the NHS, because if you don't improve working conditions and pay, people just won't want to work there. Like in 2023, 8 out of 10 nursing shifts simply didn't have enough nurses. On education,
our ministers will seek to raise educational standards and break down barriers to opportunity.
Well, one of those barriers is that 4 million children currently go to school hungry, which doesn't exactly help them learn in class, which is why some of you said,
let's look at getting children free school meals no matter what age they are. You know, even if up to the age of 16, if that has to be then means tested the older they get, then so be it.
Now, Labour is planning to spend £365 million to make sure that all primary schools in England give their kids breakfast, and the Children's Wellbeing Bill makes that legally binding. They've also put limits on the amount of branded uniforms that a school can require in order to save parents money. Now, it's also important what kids learn because it shapes how society functions. The UCU Teachers Union for 16-pluses even linked the race riots last year to a failure of education.
We crucially need social cohesion. Labour cannot and they will not deliver that if they do not reverse over a decade of brutal cuts to post-16 education and arts funding, especially for those in marginalised communities. Cuts that have played a direct role in fuelling social divisions, as we have seen most recently, and are having extremely damaging consequences.
We need to make sure the school history curriculum is telling the complete story of who we are, the good and the bad, as well as the histories of other countries so that we can have some respect for them and their achievements, rather than what I got at school, which was basically the kings and queens, the world wars, the invention of medicines, the Industrial Revolution in the UK, but without mentioning where we got the cotton that our Industrial Revolution was heavily based on. Basically stories of white British people winning wars, inventing things and looking cool. So no wonder we were convinced that 27 foreign countries needed us more than we needed them. You are arguing that one country is needed by 27 countries more than 27 countries are needed by one country.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely right.
That would imply that that one country is inherently better than 27 countries combined.
Bang on! Congratulations, you've hit the nail on the head. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. And what? So you think?
We've all been taught British white supremacy from our infancy. We also need better political education in schools because Andrew Tate and Nigel Farage and people like that, they are targeting our teens. They are well aware that millennials and older Gen Z have no time for them. But they see 12 to 17-year-olds as an easy target because many of them won't have fully switched on to political issues yet, and they wouldn't have been around properly at the time when Nigel Farage was making all his promises around Brexit. For example, before the referendum, he promised that Brexit wouldn't make us poorer economically because we'd still be able to buy and sell stuff just as easily like countries like Norway do, even though they're not in the EU, because they still have access to the EU single market.
I would want access to the single market. If Norway, Iceland and Switzerland can get deals that suit them, we can do something far, far better than that.
But then after the referendum, he said that Brexit had to mean leaving the EU without any trade deal at all.
No deal is the best deal. It's the only acceptable deal.
And we've all seen the damage that leaving the EU with a trade deal has done, so leaving the EU without one would have been even worse. And controlling immigration was the main reason he said we had to leave the EU in the first place.
There is nothing we can do to stop unlimited numbers of people from EU countries settling in this country and enjoying the same rights and privileges as all the rest of us.
But within a year of the referendum, I got him to admit on camera that that was a lie.
I'm reading right here Article 7 of the EU Citizens' Rights Directive, which says that in order to come here without a job, you need to have sufficient resources to not become a burden on the social assistance system of the host country and have comprehensive medical insurance.
Femi, in theory, you're right. In theory, under European treaties, there are restrictions that can be placed.
Now, Nigel Farage will tell you that he never co-signed Boris Johnson's lie that we send £350 million a week to the EU, and so if he left the EU, all that money would go to the NHS.
The £350 million a week we send to the EU, which we will no longer send to the EU, can you guarantee that's going to go to the NHS?
No, I can't, and I would never have made that claim.
But he did promise that we'd be billions of pounds a year richer if we voted to leave the EU, and that £3 billion of that would go into the NHS.
That UKIP can find an extra £3 billion a year for the National Health Service. We can fund that by not going on paying our massive contributions to the European Union. I put an extra £3 billion in from savings to our EU contributions.
And now, not only has he admitted that we're not richer at all because of Brexit,
is we haven't actually benefited from Brexit economically.
But in April, he effectively said he didn't want the government spending any money on the NHS.
I do not want it funded through general taxation. Right.
And I think we're going to have to move
to an insurance-based system of healthcare.
Now, looking at that before and after, it is blindingly obvious that Nigel Farage was lying to people during the Brexit referendum. But it's those lies, specifically people believing those lies, that broke British society apart. Not to mention the UK was never part of the EU's common asylum policy, so none of the people in Nigel Farage's Breaking Point poster had any EU-based rights to enter the UK, yet he was using brown faces to scare people about European migration, which is objectively racist. And even Andy Wigmore, one of the people that Nigel Farage worked with during the Brexit campaign, said that what he did was the modern-day equivalent of the Nazis. But anyone who's 18 years old now, they would have been 9 years old when all this was going on. So they only know what they've seen of people like Nigel Farage and Katie Hopkins on TikTok, where Nigel Farage has 1 million followers and rising. We need to immunize our kids against that kind of radicalization, on everything from consent to being able to critically analyze the news so that they can tell the difference between bulletins and bullshit. Now, Shout Out UK is the charity that you want to keep an eye on for that kind of stuff, because they're all about getting kids politically clued up. And on the topic of women's safety, Labour's plans to treat misogyny as a form of extremism is definitely a good step in the right direction, but I don't think we'll make any real progress on the issue until we address the chronic lack of empathy that men have for women. So that empathy has to be taught to boys. Now, I'm not saying that we softly traumatize every single 13-year-old boy by making them watch the first season of 13 Reasons Why, so that they fully understand the damage that sexual harassment and assault does to the girls in their class in a way that they can viscerally feel. But I'm also not saying that. And maybe that's not necessarily the right show for them to watch, because I know it's controversial in ways that go beyond rape culture, but I definitely think that young boys need visceral and emotional experience of how badly things can go for teenage girls. Because simply put, the stuff that they're being told just isn't working, especially as 11.5% of women are sexually abused before the age of 16. Now, since I filmed that bit, Adolescence came out, and now Keir Starmer thinks that showing that in classrooms will help the situation. But as was pointed out by gender equality author Gina Martin, the show Adolescence was never designed to explain this stuff to kids. It's an alarm bell for parents and teachers. So without actually winning any young boys over, all it might do is give Andrew Tate more of a platform in secondary schools. Which is why I lean more towards 13 Reasons Why, because you follow the experience of the girl, not just the guy, and so you develop more empathy for what the girl is going through, which is something that the show Adolescence lacks, and the show itself admits that.
We followed Jamie's brain around this entire case. Yeah. Katie isn't important, Jamie is. Everyone will remember Jamie, no one will remember her.
So yeah, Keir Starmer should probably give this one a bit more thought. And in terms of education in general,
I am providing £6.7 billion of capital investment to the Department for Education next year, a 19% real terms increase on this year.
Then there's the question of private schools.
We will introduce VAT on private school fees from January 2025. And we will shortly introduce legislation to remove their business rates relief from April 2025.
Taxing private schools, except for those concerned specifically with special educational needs, is an objectively progressive move. Because private schools are simply vehicles of social inequality, ensuring that the richest kids get an even further head start in life. And in keeping with the theme of privatization versus nationalization of public services and utilities, keeping public services and utilities in public hands, you were all very clear about that when it came to the NHS.
To be a national social care.
A healthcare system that is entirely owned by the public sector.
Fix the NHS.
He could also stop trying to bring in privatisation into the NHS, even if it is just to help out.
And they offer privatisation of the NHS.
I want a functioning NHS. I mean, it saved my life. It continues to preserve my life.
My government will improve the National Health Service as a service for all, providing care on the basis of need, regardless of the ability to pay. Focus on prevention.
But that's exactly what Health Secretary Wes Streeting says he wants to do.
And there's nothing about my centre-left principles that says, because I believe in the NHS as a public service, I'm willing to see working class people waiting longer, even where there's spare capacity in the private sector that we could use via the NHS to get those people treated faster. I have sympathy with people who say, but shouldn't the NHS have the staff, the equipment, the theatre space that they need to treat everyone? Of course it should, but rebuilding that takes time. So in the meantime, I'm looking to pull every single lever I can to make sure that people get treated as fast as possible and as safely as possible.
And while I do understand the concept of just doing whatever it takes to get people healthy now, every penny that's spent on the private sector, often at a higher cost, is money that isn't being spent fixing the NHS. And given that Starmer's whole thing is that he's against what he calls
sticking plaster politics,
where politicians come up with short-term fixes to get them through to the next election but don't tackle the long-term problems, that seems a little at odds. Now, he says he'll fix the long-term problems in the NHS by
a shift from hospital to community, better primary care, community services, mental health, social care, a shift from analogue to digital, make sure we've got the latest treatments and technology, but also the improvements to the systems, the waste, the inefficiency, the bureaucracy we see in the NHS, and thirdly, a shift from sickness to prevention. We pay a very heavy price in this country, a price of society's sickness. Actually, if we help people not just to live longer, but live well for longer, that's not just better for them, it's better for the taxpayer, and that's how the NHS is sustainable.
And yes, preventing people getting to the point where they need a doctor or a GP would obviously help the NHS. So we'll have to see if he actually does do those things, and what groups like the British Medical Association say about Labour's actions over the next year or so. Now, the budget did provide a lot of money for the NHS.
That I am providing a £22.6 billion increase in the day-to-day health budget and a £3.1 billion increase in the capital budget over this year and next.
But obviously the financial side is necessary, but not sufficient. It's also about how efficiently that money is spent in terms of actually improving national health.
And on water and rail?
Dumping sewage into our water is absolutely disgusting and really needs to be stopped. So I think the sooner we can get water at least back into public hands, the better.
And a bill will be introduced to strengthen the powers of the water regulator.
But renationalise the railways and the water.
I want him to focus on nationalising the energy companies and rail companies.
Nationalising rail and bus.
Establishing Great British Railways and bringing train operators into public ownership.
So ultimately, we'll see how far Keir Starmer goes on these things.
Now, you may have heard we have a bit of a housing crisis, and it's not just that 309,000 people are currently homeless in England alone, making it urgent to build more affordable homes.
Today, I am providing over £5 billion of government investment to deliver our plans on housing next year. We will increase the Affordable Homes Programme to £3.1 billion, delivering thousands of new homes. We will provide £3 billion worth of support in guarantees to boost the supply of homes and support our small house builders.
Now that's a start, because the lack of supply of houses is what's affecting the power dynamic between landlords and renters, but so do the laws around that relationship.
And things like rent control.
For example, around 80,000 households have faced homelessness in the last 5 years because landlords have had the power to simply kick people out without any justification, also known as Section 21 no-fault evictions.
Landlords have a lot of power when it comes to privately renting a property. They are able to issue tenants with Section 21s on a whim. This is leaving thousands of people in temporary accommodation in London every month alone. This Section 21 needs to be completely scrapped. We also need a cap on rents as well.
This is where Labour's new Renters' Rights Bill comes in.
Legislation will be introduced to give greater rights and protections to people renting their homes, including ending no-fault evictions and reforming grounds for possession.
Honestly, so much of this bill excited me, especially as a new renter myself. Now, yes, there are improvements that need to be made, but see for yourself. Now, all tenancies are going to be periodic, so if you're renting a place, you won't just get 6 months and then have to leave. You'll automatically be renewed every month until the landlord gives you 2 months notice to leave. And they'll have to give specific reasons for this, and only certain reasons will be accepted by the courts. Basically, that ends no-fault evictions, which let landlords just throw you out. The bill also means that landlords will only be able to throw you out if you fall 3 months behind on your rent, rather than just 2 months. It also says that landlords will only be able to increase your rent once a year at a level that's consistent with the market. Landlords are also going to have to register with a central database, which will make it easier for potential renters to look into their landlords before they sign with them, and also makes it easier to report the landlords to the Ombudsman. The bill also allows renters to demand that landlords fix issues like mold within a specified period of time. They're also putting restrictions on the renting process itself. For example, I recently moved home, and looking for a place place was hard. A couple of times I'd view a place alongside other people looking for a flat, and even though several of us would stay behind because we wanted to get the place, a couple of months later that place would still be on the market. Why? Because the landlord was trying to see if he could get more money. Landlords are squeezing us dry for the hell of it. And that's why the Renters' Rights Bill requires landlords to publish the amount they want for the property first, and if they accept anything higher than that, they can be fined up to £40,000. That should put an end to the bidding wars between potential renters, which is even more of an issue for ethnic minority renters. The young housing charity Generation Rent did experiments, and they found that black applicants who reached out to landlords to rent a place were 36% less likely to receive a positive response and 17% less likely to receive any response at all compared to white applicants. This causes a number of problems, because when you combine it with the bidding wars that renters have often been forced into, that leaves black applicants often having to pay more to live in the nicer accommodation in the nicer areas. And because black and brown people are statistically less well off than white people, that means that fewer black and brown people live in those nicer areas, which statistically tend to be more white areas. And that creates a vicious circle, because you then have politicians saying
multiculturalism makes no demands of the incomer to integrate. It has failed because it allowed people to come to our society and live parallel lives in it.
But when people come to our country, they should also commit to integration. We risk becoming an island of strangers.
Which further damages the perception of ethnic minority people, because it implies that they're not nice to live and socialise with, which makes the landlords in the nicer areas even less likely to rent to them. Now, how do you fix this? I would argue that the whole process needs to be anonymised, like I said with job applications, but it's a bit more complicated than in a work context, because all your references are going to be personal connections who don't know you via your national insurance number. So the landlord making the decisions will almost certainly have all the information that they may have biases against. And so maybe the issue needs to be addressed at a more fundamental level, either by addressing racism directly via education, or, and this might sound crazy, tackling the very concept of landlords by making it legally and fiscally impossible to own multiple properties, enabling you to rent them out, so that it's no longer up to landlords to decide whether working class people get to live comfortably or not. And if you think that sounds too radical, again, we're living through the alternative. So if you have any other ways around that, please don't just let me know, let Labour know. And for another topic, trans people.
The statements that have been made recently about trans rights and trans people, demonising them.
I want him to be supporting trans rights after parading Brianna Gay's mother around. It's absolutely disgusting.
And constantly using real people, trans people, as a political football.
I voted Green. I couldn't vote for Labour because Labour are demonising trans people.
Especially as a trans woman, I no longer feel I can vote for Keir Starmer, as he's now alienated both us, but also the entire LGBT community from the party. So that's why I voted Green.
I am so tired of the whole trans debate. I am trans. I am not a debate. I am a person and I deserve to live, which is why I was unable to vote for the Labour Party.
As far as I can tell, they're just tired. Hell, everybody is. If you need an example of how screwed up our voting system is, listen to this.
Labour, I did vote for you, but just because you were the only option to get the Tories out of this seat. I fucking hate Labour, especially Keir Starmer's stance on trans people like me. Don't listen to fucking J.K. Rowling.
Imagine being forced to vote for people who you know are a threat to you just to avoid people who are even worse. But we'll get to the voting system later. And just like with racism and xenophobia, how you talk about these issues matters, because it can increase the levels of aggression against groups that are already the targets of hate crimes. But again, we are where we are, so what are Labour actually doing?
A draft bill will be brought forward to ban conversion practices.
Now, in Labour's draft conversion practices bill, they say they're banning conversion therapy because any attempt to change somebody's gender identity has no place in our society. Now, as my followers said, we're tired of the trans debate, so I'm not here to have that with you. I'm just here to discuss how Labour's been handling it. Besides, I don't even think there's a lot of difference between people's understanding of the sex and gender issue. I think the main difference is the level of empathy that people have for the people involved. Ultimately, it's about how you deal with the fact that society has created different categories as to what's feminine and what's masculine, also known as gender, which isn't justified by biology, i.e. sex. Like, there's no biological reason why men can't wear pink tights.
Trans people didn't create these stereotypes. They're just positioning themselves around a fire that everybody else started. Now, you can disagree with how they've chosen to do that if you want. Like, I don't agree with religious people. I can even privately think that they'd be happier if they saw things my way. I don't, because I know that I'm less happy since I lost my Christian faith, but I still respect that that's a choice that they've made for their lives, and I care whether they're happy. The people who've been using trans people as a political football, they don't care. The people who go around asking what is a woman when they know that because of gender, the social construct, and sex, the biological one, there are two answers to that question, but they're trying to get a gotcha, they don't care. They're just playing games, and yet I'm yet to see a Labour politician properly call that out. So let's look at this rationally. If Labour is saying that it is wrong to try and change somebody's gender identity, then that means they're accepting that somebody can identify as a gender, the social category, that doesn't match their sex, the biological category. Cool, that's the literal definition of a trans person. And if you have empathy for trans people at all in that situation, then you would want to make their lives as happy as possible. That means that any discussion around medical intervention, gender-affirming care, puberty blockers has to be had in that context in the best interest of the individual. But Labour looks set to ban puberty blockers indefinitely, and while that conversation is beyond my expertise, I do want to make a point about the inconsistency. Because while banning conversion therapy, Labour said that any attempt to change somebody's gender identity has no place in our society. So Labour appears to be supporting the principle that some people have genders that don't match their sex. So to ban the medical care that most people in that situation say would make their lives happier seems flawed to me. Again, trans people didn't start this fire. If you have an issue with gender, if you're gender critical, then your issues with mainstream society that's been cementing these ideas about how men and women should look and behave in the minds of people for thousands of years. Trans people, making up less than 0.5% of the population, are literally the least of your problems.
And one of the most urgent issues for Labour to address.
My government will play its part in trying to secure long-term peace and security in the Middle East. It is committed to a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state.
Ceasefire in Gaza, not selling weapons.
I'm not voting for a party that supports Israel.
They are not calling for a free Palestine.
I'm extremely pro-Palestine.
Stop arms sales.
I've also been horrified at his and Labour's response to genocide happening in Gaza. They are truly not doing enough to stop what's happening there, to advocate for a permanent, long-lasting ceasefire and a stop to arms sales to Israel.
The Labour MP in my area is a friend of Israel.
Your stance on Gaza, talking about the right to cut off water to people. So today I voted Green because they're committed to an immediate ceasefire.
I'm probably never going to vote for Keir Starmer's Labour, but if he does ever want my vote, he could start by recognising the state of Palestine and assisting in the prosecution of Israel for their war crimes, and supporting a ceasefire, and also not selling them their arms.
I personally think that genocide is wrong, and so anyone that stands with Israel is someone that I cannot morally support.
Now, Labour has currently banned 30 out of the 350 types of military item that we currently sell to Israel, and that is simply not enough. With over 40,000 people dead in Gaza, the conversation should be, how do we stop Israel and hold Hamas and the Israeli government accountable for their war crimes in court? Instead, Labour is forcing us to have a conversation about how much do we help the country that is currently committing genocide. The Israeli ambassador has literally argued for the complete destruction of Gaza, an area of over 2 million people.
Gaza has an underground tunnel city, and in order to get to this underground tunnel city, those areas must be destroyed. And one of the things we expose to the world, every school, every mosque, every second house has an access to tunnel. So this is, and of course ammunition.
But that's an argument for destroying the whole of Gaza, every single building in it.
So do you have another solution?
And while David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, was announcing that we'd keep selling 320 of the 350 military items to Israel, he acknowledged the genocidal language that the Israeli government has been using.
And I condemn the language that's been used by ministers in the Israeli government, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, particularly in relation to this. It's entirely unacceptable.
But if he's condemning that language, then he knows that the politics of the country that he's selling these weapons to is condemnable. So the number of weapons we should be selling to Israel is 0. But David Lammy seems to be waiting until the number of dead in Gaza reaches the millions before we call it genocidal.
Those terms were largely used when millions of people lost their lives in crises like Rwanda, the Second World War and the Holocaust. And the way that they are used now undermines the seriousness of that term.
Even though the official UN definition says that genocide is the attempt to wipe out part of a population regardless of its size. And any legal or contractual argument against a full arms embargo dies the moment you look at the arms trade treaty that the UK has signed, because that says we're not allowed to sell weapons when there's an overriding risk that those weapons will be used for human rights abuses. And the International Court of Justice has confirmed that Israel is probably committing genocide, and the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for the Netanyahu government. And if it's for political reasons, Israel isn't making us more safe. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Whether it's selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which is being used to kill hundreds of thousands of people in Yemen, or selling weapons to Israel, which is being used to kill tens of thousands of people in Gaza, we're sending the message to the Middle East that Western capitalism comes at the expense of thousands of innocent Muslim lives. Do you think that helps our national security? Do you think that increases or decreases the risk that somebody from that part of the world might want to hurt us? So whenever you hear a politician say that we've got to do this or that because that country is our ally, ask yourself whether that friendship is actually just creating more enemies for us. And yes, I am saying we need to keep the pressure up to ban the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia as well, because while my opinion of Jeremy Corbyn may have dropped to sub-zero because of Brexit,
but the reason I used to be a huge fan of him was because he was one of the only people in Parliament that was actually standing up for the people of Yemen and against the sale of the weapons that have been used to kill over 400,000 of them.
Now, I did appreciate this one.
My government will take steps to help rebuild trust and foster respect. Legislation will be brought forward to introduce a duty of candour for public servants.
That's their new Hillsborough law, and it's basically about preventing cover-ups. Now, the King's Speech document says that the scope of it is yet to be determined. And Starmer said this at conference.
Because today I can confirm that the duty of candour will apply to public authorities and public servants. The bill will include criminal sanctions, and that the Hillsborough law will be introduced to Parliament before the next anniversary in April.
So again, it's a step in the right direction, but does it apply to politicians? And would it apply to this? Because 97 people died in Hillsborough, and I agree, we do need criminal sanctions for the lives of politicians when that many lives are at stake. How many people do you think died from this lie? All our medical experts say that Brexit has been damaging the NHS before, during and after the pandemic, where literally hundreds of thousands of people died. Add to that the NHS crises we've faced since. The Nuffield Trust, the biggest medical charity in the UK, say that Brexit has made medicines, equipment and staff harder to come by. The BMA, which represents 150,000 doctors across the UK, say Brexit has cost us 4,000 doctors. So if Brexit has been making our NHS staffing crisis worse, our medicines shortage worse, during several major national health disasters, then there will be a number of deaths that are directly tied to that lie. And I can tell you this, it'll be a hell of a lot more than 97. And I'm not saying that politicians aren't allowed to get things wrong. I'm talking about when they say things that they have no reasonable grounds to believe are true as the basis for a campaign in a national vote. And all the medical experts at the time were saying that Brexit would be bad for the NHS. And 9 out of 10 economists said that Brexit would make us poorer. So any money we stopped sending to the EU would not be there to spend on the NHS because it would make us that much poorer. And Boris Johnson knew that too.
London, it has the single biggest potential for per capita GDP of any of those cities. And that is because we have a young, growing, highly skilled population. We're not just a valued and, by the way, fully paid up member of the EU, which we will remain. We will remain a paid up, valued, participating member of the single market. And there is under no circumstances, in my view, will a British government adjust that position.
I'd vote to stay in the single market. I'm in favour of the single market. I want us to be able to trade freely with our European friends.
So if we're serious about restoring trust in politics, then if a politician makes such a huge statement that they have no reasonable grounds for believing is true, and it results in major damage to the economy, security or health of the country, they should be held criminally responsible for it. Because if you or I lied to the government on our tax returns, costing them maybe £1,000, we'd go to jail. So why can politicians like Boris Johnson tell a huge lie that costs the country £100 billion a year and nothing happens to them? Because I'd much rather know that if a politician makes a bold claim during an election that would affect the welfare of millions, they're at least willing to bet their own welfare on it. That would make me trust politicians a little more. Because we are where we are right now because a man who was on record saying multiple times that the UK relied on the EU for its economic well-being decided to lie about Brexit in order to ride a wave of nationalism into Downing Street. So if we're going to fix that, we need to flip it on its head. We need to know that it'll never be in a politician's interest to lie.
And while we're on the topic of trust in politics, what the fuck is this? You've seen the stories of Labour politicians accepting free stuff from big business and big donors. And I'm not even talking about whether or not it's right for politicians to be accepting free stuff from big business. That's not what pisses me off about this. It's that for the last 4 years, the Labour Party's strategy has been to avoid saying or doing anything too progressive, like opposing Brexit or calling out the clear racism of their political opponents.
On climate change, growth, aspiration, levelling up, Brexit, economic responsibility. We are the party of the centre ground.
They chose to keep their heads down and not rock the boat, while the Tories lost the trust of the public via COVID, Partygate, and corruption scandal after corruption scandal after corruption scandal. And progressive voters were told to just shut up and take it because Labour had a master plan to defeat the Tories by not doing anything that the Daily Mail or the Telegraph might use against them. Yet during all that time, when they were supposedly on their best behaviour for the public, they were accepting huge donations from corporations? Like, even if it's not corrupt and it's all totally above board, if you or I were in charge of Labour, there is no way in hell we would allow that to happen, giving the right-wing press so much ammunition to use against us, while supporting Brexit in order to avoid giving the right-wing press ammunition to use against us. Like, corruption aside, it is spitting in the face of progressive voters.
And that spit is only in our faces because as progressive voters in a two-party system, we're forced to support one of the two main parties to prevent the far right from destroying millions of lives. Which brings us to the most important issue of the next 5 years, and arguably of our lifetimes. And that is the absolute state of the UK's system of democracy. And I say system of democracy, not democracy, because the UK isn't one. Because in almost every single election, a party with a minority of the vote gets a majority of the seats in Parliament, meaning that the majority of votes that went to the other parties have no effect on policy. How can you call that a democracy? Because if I were to ask you, what is a democracy, you would say a system where the decisions that are made reflect, broadly speaking, the wishes of the majority of the people. Well, the UK has never been that. That's why for a lot of voters, a major issue was
voter reform.
Proportional representation.
Voting reform, because first past the post is absolute bullshit.
Proportional representation. I'm off to vote for Labour. My vote is conditional. What I want to see, more than anything else, is voter reform. Doesn't matter what you guys do in the next 4 or 5 years. If the Conservatives sneak and slip their way back in because you didn't change the voting system, everything will get destroyed again. That's my priority. That's the price of my vote.
And he's right. The majority of the people have voted for parties to the left of the Conservatives in almost every single election since the Second World War, and yet the Tories have been in power for almost 2/3 of that time. So this voting system consistently gives us governments that are more right-wing than the actual people. So yes, we got Labour this time, just like we got Labour in 1997, but most of the time, it doesn't work out that way. Because if there are more parties on the left than there are on the right, that means that left-wing voters are split between multiple parties, so it's harder for the left to win. And in our voting system, all that matters is winning, coming first, hence the phrase first past the post. And if Starmer doesn't change that, the right will win again. And the way things are looking between Farage and Kemi Badenoch, when I ask myself, who are right-wing voters more likely to vote for, a black woman or a white man, it might not be the Tories who sneak back in, especially as right now, as I'm recording this, the Reform Party is topping the polls. So Nigel Farage is set to be our next Prime Minister.
And that's what's especially dangerous about it, because the members of the Labour Party have voted overwhelmingly to change the voting system to one where all votes count equally, but it's the leadership of the Labour Party that is opposing that. And the worst thing about it is, Labour ministers know they are standing in the way of the UK being a functioning democracy for their own political gain.
So given that right now, in every single election, especially right now, as you only had 34% of the vote and have 62% of the seats in Parliament, the majority of votes have gone to parties that essentially have no say on policy. So the majority of votes have no effect on our policies. So can we be a democracy if the majority of votes have no effect on policy making? So is that something you think we should change?
Democracy does matter.
Okay, so you want the majority of votes to count then?
No, I'm saying
no.
We're committed.
No.
Oh, stop being silly. We're focusing on delivering our manifesto.
But I'm literally saying, how about you make it so the majority of votes count? And you are telling me no.
It's a priority. It's not a priority.
In every election, a party with only a minority of the vote gets a majority of the seats, especially now, meaning that the majority of votes have no effect on policy. Is that something that you would like to change?
I mean, I'll do you a proper interview if you want to ask me to. But I'm really proud that we've got a big Labour majority and a big Labour government, and that we're now going to be putting into practice the things that we campaigned on, and all the changes we've already made.
Let me translate that. Her reaction to hearing that the majority of UK votes have no effect on policy is to say, I'm really glad that worked out for our party. Okay, but that still leaves the majority of people being democratically powerless in the UK. Is that something you'd like the Labour government to change?
I've got no plans to change. We've got no plans to change the voting system.
So not only are they admitting that they're protecting a system where the majority of votes don't count, but they're admitting that they're doing that because once every couple of decades, it benefits them. Again, proportional representation, a fair voting system, is the single most important policy for Labour to fix as soon as possible. And if you think I'm blowing that out of proportion, excuse the pun, just remember, in 2019, 52% of the votes went to parties that were offering a second referendum on Brexit. This would have allowed the public to choose between the Brexit deal, once it was negotiated, and remaining in the EU. And even Nigel Farage said that if we were given that choice,
to get a second referendum on the deal and staying in the EU.
And
I can see it clearly.
And do you know what, Colin? Colin, Remain wins that referendum and wins it every single time.
So if we'd had a voting system where all votes counted equally in 2019, then parties committed to a second referendum would have had a majority in Parliament, and we would still be in the EU. Families would therefore be £1,000 a year richer. Our food would be less expensive. We wouldn't have gone through a pandemic with a Boris Johnson government that had spent the previous 4 years telling everybody to ignore experts. And so we probably would have locked down earlier, saving tens of thousands of lives. Jeremy Corbyn, for all my issues with him, would have been forced into a coalition with the SNP and Lib Dems, so working class people would have been protected during this cost of living crisis, instead of the Tories, who took every chance they could to transfer more money to the rich, whether through Liz Truss's economy-crashing tax cuts for billionaires, or Rishi Sunak literally bragging about taking money from poor areas to give to rich ones. It affects everything. In 2019, if you compare the number of votes the Green Party got compared to the number of seats they got in Parliament, Tory votes were worth 21 times more than Green votes. That's because as a smaller party, if the Green Party gets, say, 10% in every constituency, you would expect they'd get 10% of the MPs in Parliament, right? But under first past the post, you have to come first in your constituency in order to get any MPs at all. So all the votes for the parties that don't come first in any given town are simply thrown away. As a result, the votes for the Green Party simply don't count as much as the votes for Labour or the Tories. So tell me, how do you expect to solve the climate crisis if the votes for the Green Party simply don't count in most towns? And for the record, I know I haven't covered Labour's environmental policy, mainly because I don't feel qualified, but also because I only really have one thing to say. The main argument that is ever used against green policies is that it costs money. The whole narrative that the Reform Party is spinning around net zero is that it's going to make working class people poorer, that it'll cost them at the petrol pump. So it is the responsibility of anybody who cares about the environment to make the argument that it is not going to be working class people who pay for the green transition. Whether it's solar panels, biofuels, wind energy, Keir Starmer needs to be making the argument that it is going to be the rich who pay for that. But again, because Keir Starmer is too scared of taxing the rich, he is losing the argument on net zero. And the Green Party isn't getting enough seats in Parliament to challenge him because of the voting system. So changing the voting system to one where all votes count equally
won't solve everything by itself, but it is key to solving all our problems. So when you hear Labour politicians try to argue that changing the voting system isn't that big a deal to people. Last year, 80% of the members voted in favour of proportional representation, and now the majority of the public be reflected.
You say the majority of the public. I have to say, no one ever brings it up with me. But anyway.
They're lying to you because they know that any family that cares about the cost of living crisis cares about changing the voting system and Brexit, whether they know that or not. They're simply counting on you not knowing the effect that changing the voting system and undoing Brexit would have on your family finances. Because most people want to redistribute wealth to help millions of people out of poverty. The Tories don't. So if you're wondering what you can do to fix the country, you need to be having that conversation with literally everybody you can find about how the UK is not a democracy because most votes don't count, and that Keir Starmer is the reason why. You need to be following groups like Make Votes Matter, Labour Movement for PR, the Electoral Reform Society and the Movement Forward so that you can get in on any action they do to pressure Keir Starmer. You might even consider heading to Parliament on the 5th of November this year and blocking the place until Keir Starmer budges on this. Because I don't want Keir Starmer to be able to get through a single interview without somebody asking him, so, Sir Starmer, why do you believe the majority of British votes shouldn't count? Because lives are literally on the line if we let a Conservative or Nigel Farage become Prime Minister. You watch the Tories cost the lives of thousands of people who didn't need to die because of corruption and their pathological rejection of expertise. You watch them drive millions of people deeper into poverty via Brexit, via austerity. You watch them use racism to get communities to hunt other communities. That's what's at stake if we don't get rid of this voting system that allows a party to gain majority control in Parliament with only a minority of the votes. And yes, it will mean that Nigel Farage's Reform Party will get more seats in Parliament, but for starters, that's democracy. If the number of seats they get in Parliament reflect the number of people that voted for them, then that's a reflection of who we are as a country. We shouldn't be using an unfair voting system to cover up who we really are. It's our job to show up to vote to prove that that is not who we are. Second of all, the majority of the votes have always gone to parties to the left of the Tories, so even if Nigel Farage did get more seats in Parliament, it would still be the left that was broadly in charge. Whereas the way things are going now, Nigel Farage is set to be the Prime Minister of the UK, even though the majority of the people are still going to vote to the left. Third of all, more young people will vote if they know that the votes of parties like the Greens will actually count for something. And fourth of all, dragging these people out into the light of day only helps us. They only had 5 MPs. One of them is Nigel Farage, who has a list of problematic quotes as long as the Q in the Breaking Point poster. Lee Anderson, who literally joined the Reform Party because he was deemed to be too Islamophobic for the Tories. Richard Tice, who's the co-founder of the anti-Semitic Leave.eu organisation. James McMurdoch, who went to jail for beating his girlfriend. And Rupert Lowe, who the Reform Party themselves say is a violent criminal. Not to mention, I got the Reform Party's candidates to admit themselves that Brexit, the reason their party even exists because it was originally called the Brexit Party, is making people poorer. And that if they were in charge, they would make people even poorer still.
There'd definitely be a gap between a no-deal Brexit as proposed by the Reform Party and however long it takes for us to get that. So in that time, we'd have made food significantly more expensive before we can actually make our own.
Sometimes you have to take a little pain with some things for it to work.
So the more these people step out into the light of the parliamentary process, the more we can show people how radioactive they are for the entire country, and the fewer votes they'll get. For example, if UKIP had had, say, 30 seats in Parliament in the 20 years leading up to Brexit, then Brexit would never have happened, because they would have had to present a specific plan for how you take back control of our laws without raising prices for Brits by increasing the red tape on all of our supply chains. Like, even now the Brexiteers can't agree on what kind of deal they want. Instead, they got to just vaguely scream at the EU for 40 years, and that's how Brexit happened. Now, Labour says
measures to modernise the Constitution will be introduced, including House of Lords reform, to remove the right of hereditary peers to sit and vote in the Lords.
Cool, good call, but it's insane that people were ever allowed to become members of the House of Lords simply because they were born into it. So that's the right decision, but it's not what people have been asking for. People have been asking for a fair voting system. So when you say
a country that gives equal voice to every person, that is the Britain we are building.
That's clearly bullshit, because in 2020, Starmer said,
on electoral reform, we've got to address the fact that millions of people vote in safe seats and they feel their vote doesn't count. And that's got to be addressed. We will never get full participation in our electoral system until we do that at every level. So we need to address that.
Which means that he knows that our current voting system isn't fair and needs to be replaced with a proportional system. And yet in November, when he was discussing it in Parliament, he said,
"Look, proportional representation is not our policy. We won't be making time for it." And I just gently say to him, he didn't do too badly under the system as it is.
So like the ministers who I interviewed, Keir Starmer is knowingly standing in the way of British democracy.
Bring in proportional representation. Not doing so, I think, is cowardly. It's holding on to power for all the wrong reasons and not listening to your party, who voted for that.
But fixing the problems in UK democracy goes well beyond just changing the voting system. And for that, I'm going to allow Abby Heffer, a doctorate-level specialist in the politics of authoritarianism, speak for me.
So following Femi, this is what I expect of this Labour government. Labour won a landslide because we want change. The change I want to see is really easy. I want a government defined by democratic accountability. I want this Labour government to legislate against itself. I want this Labour government to pave the way for a more equal and representative system where everyone from Reform UK to Workers' Party voters are represented. I want proportional representation, but proportional representation is just a start. I want a Labour government that takes protests seriously, that legalises protest, that rolls back the authoritarian legislation of the last 3 years, because we can see that you take protester demands seriously. It was written over every manifesto this time around. We know that protest is a legitimate democratic form of political participation, as important as casting a vote every 4 or 5 years.
But Labour hasn't lifted a finger to undo the anti-protest laws left by the Tories. In fact, their hostility towards protest since they took office has been the same as the Tories.
We are still selling arms to Israel. I thought we were voting for change, Rachel.
This is a changed Labour Party, a Labour Party that represents working people.
My sister was I think this guy's obviously got a pass from the 2019 conference. We changed the party. While he's been protesting, we've been changing the party. That's why we've got a Labour government.
Those people were protesting against the Labour government helping to commit genocide, and the Labour Party's leaders treated them like bird poo that needed to be wiped off the bottom of their shoes, while making fun of the very concept of protest. That's about as Tory as it gets. And that's why the most generous interpretation that I can give of this Labour government is that unlike the Tories, who were driving the wrong direction down the motorway, smashing our cars apart as they went, Labour's vehicle is at least facing in the right direction, but in the wrong gear. And even that I am struggling to say because of their cuts to disability support. There are things that they're doing that I am truly excited about, but they are moving too slowly because they're too scared of doing anything that the Daily Mail or Nigel Farage might accuse of being too progressive or a betrayal of Brexit. And as a result, they're not going to improve people's lives enough during this parliament for people to feel that things are really going in the right direction for them. And after people have already lost faith in the Tories, once they've lost faith in both major parties, that'll leave the door wide open for Nigel Farage to simply stroll into Downing Street. And you get how totally insane that is, right? Because there probably isn't going to be an election before 2026, so the next election will be more than 10 years after the Brexit referendum, and yet Keir Starmer is prioritising the wishes of voters from a decade ago over the needs of voters now. With the insane additional irony that he's doing that because he's scared of what Nigel Farage will say about him. But Nigel Farage is going to use Starmer's failure to do what's necessary to end the cost of living crisis as a reason to vote against Starmer, which means that Starmer's fear of Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister is what's going to make Nigel Farage our next Prime Minister. And he's scared of taxing the income of the super rich because he's scared of what Conservatives might say about him. Why? Well, part of it is because in the two-party system, every party has to try and appeal to as many different ideologies as possible, because if you only appeal to like the left wing, and the left wing vote is split between multiple parties, then under first past the post, the right wing party will get more than you, and you'll get nothing in Parliament. And that's why parties try to aim just down the middle.
We are the party of the centre ground.
The problem with that is you're never going to out-Brexit Nigel Farage. Anybody who's choosing who they're going to vote for based on how much they back Brexit is always going to choose Farage over Starmer. The only reason Starmer was able to oust the Tories is because after 14 years of
of the Tories, people could see that the Tories weren't helping them, which is why Starmer was literally saying,
If that sounds conservative, then let me tell you, I don't care.
he wanted those voters, but if he doesn't deliver for people, then many people will just turn back to the Tories or head towards Nigel Farage. And this has to end. Since 2016, on the biggest issues of the day, Labour has just copied the Tories. In the 4 years where Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, Brexit was the single biggest policy issue facing the UK, and Corbyn sided with the Tories because he was too scared to do what he knew progressive voters wanted.
Your members want to be inside the single market, and they want to be inside the customs union, and they want a second referendum. Now, you always say that you listen to your members. Why do you not listen to them about these things?
I listen to members all the time. There are numbers of opinion polls been done. I'm not familiar with all of the questions that have been put to them. Yes, the membership of the Labour Party overwhelmingly voted to remain. Overwhelmingly, Labour supporters voted to remain, but a third of them didn't. A third of them voted the other way. I want to win the next election.
He literally said we should leave the single market, and that's precisely the kind of Brexit that we have now.
When you're asked, would you like to see us leave the single market, you can't tell us.
The single market is dependent on membership of the EU. What we've said all along is that we want a tariff-free trade, access to the European market, and a partnership with Europe in the future.
But to be absolutely crystal clear, we leave the single European market because we leave the EU.
The two things are inextricably
So we have to leave
linked.
the single market.
Now, yes, he eventually said that we should have a second referendum, but only after 3 years of saying that Brexit should go ahead, no ifs, no buts. So on balance, on the biggest issue facing him, he copied the Tories out of fear. Same with Starmer, supporting Brexit, supporting Israel, leaning into conservative policies and rhetoric because he's too scared of the right. And it doesn't work. Yes, it got him elected, but he's plummeting in the polls because he's pleasing nobody. He's not right-wing enough for the people that Farage is going after, and he's not left-wing enough for progressive voters. And we've seen how this plays out. Macron is barely hanging on in France because he's aiming down the middle as well. He's not doing enough for working class people, and so Le Pen's far right are scratching at the walls of power. Kamala Harris tried to appeal to the Republican right, but they'd all been radicalized by Trump in the same way that our right-wing voters have been radicalized by Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. So there was never any hope of winning them over. All it did was alienate progressive voters. Western countries are deeply unequal, with millions left behind struggling in poverty, so it needs policies aimed at equality to pull people out of that poverty. And any policy that is aimed at fixing social injustices is by definition woke. So if politicians are too scared to do anything that the Daily Mail might call woke, then they'll be leaving millions of working class people stuck in poverty. And politicians like Nigel Farage will come along and say, the left won't help you, but I will. They'll say you're in poverty not because we maintain systems that allow you to be exploited on low wages. They'll say you're in poverty because other poor people who are just like you but in a different shade are also being exploited on low wages. They'll say all we need to do is close the borders and treat minorities as the problem, and we'll deliver all the good things the left said they'd give you. And Nigel Farage will be our next Prime Minister if we fail, especially with Elon Musk helping him. That's what's at stake here if we don't force Starmer to act right through whatever peaceful means necessary. Because personally, I don't fancy being chased through the street and beaten up because of the colour of my skin. And if you've heard everything I've said and part of your brain is going, but Femi, don't attack Starmer because you'll help the Tories get in. Let's just check the scorecard. Because before the election, you were saying that we shouldn't criticise Starmer because that would help the Tories get in. And after the election, you're saying we shouldn't criticise Starmer because that would help the Tories get in. So you're effectively saying we should never push the Labour Party to be better. You are explicitly supporting the two-party system that allows the Tories and Labour to make sure that we never get the prosperous and fair country that we all need. You're happy to let Starmer keep supporting a voting system that means that most votes don't count, and so we never have any real options other than the Tories or Labour. And progressive voters will never vote Tories, so by saying we should never criticise Labour, you're saying that this country should never get anything better than what a handful of statistically men at the top of Labour decide is best for us. And most of the time it won't even be Labour because this voting system keeps spitting up Tory prime ministers. So I'm telling you that you have not just the right but the duty to make sure that you do everything in your power to pressure Keir Starmer's Labour Party to do better. Through protest, through conversations at the dinner table, conversations at work, conversations on dates. Because it's not just about who you vote for, it's about making sure that there are enough voters out there who are committed to specific policy objectives so that politicians know that if they don't meet those objectives, they will lose. So again, make sure that everybody you interact with knows that the UK is a country where the party of government never has a majority of the votes, and
and yet has majority control in Parliament, meaning the majority of votes have no effect on policy, is not a democracy. Because any country where the majority of votes don't count is not a democracy. And make sure that they know that any Labour politician that isn't on board with giving us a voting system where all votes count equally is the reason why their lives aren't getting better. Those politicians are the reason why we keep getting governments that don't care about the things that we care about. Those politicians are the reason why they felt politically powerless their entire lives. And make sure they know what Nigel Farage has even admitted to doing to all of us. We have a major opportunity here. Gen Z and millennials can change the future of the UK in ways that have never been seen before, because our generations in the UK are relatively more left-wing than any generation ever before when they were our age. So if we get a voting system where all votes count equally and use that to deliver a country where everybody has an equal chance in life, then the future of the UK could be absolutely fucking amazing. So there is hope, but the work starts now.